Thank you so much, James. I'm so happy to be here, and I want to introduce Alain in a different way, because you all know who is Alain Badiou, but I want to speak on my Alain Badiou. And it's a story of relationship with a mentor, with a teacher, with a friend. And to be here, it's also very unique for me, even just as an introduction, because with James, by the way, after my dearest friend Giuliano Merchamis has been murdered, we went, James, Slavoj Žižek, and myself, to do a seminar on cinema in Ramallah in his memory. And just yesterday I came back from a seminar in Ramallah on Walter Benjamin with our friend Slavoj Žižek. So I tried to tell in these 5.5 minutes I still have a story of community, of people that feel that they have responsibility. And really first time when I really came to learn set theory and to learn philosophy from Alain. But through the time I find myself trying to do art in different places. And one of his topic or lectures really strike me and became, in a way, a guide for many failures I achieved in my life. And it was a text about militant art and what is militant art. At the beginning, it was very beautiful speech about weakness that came from Alain Badiou, that usually we know him as the one who speaks about revolution, about power, about conviction. And suddenly it brought me a text about weakness that I hold in myself for hard times I didn't know to come. And it's kind of a present I received from him that I want just to share it shortly. So I went to Janine refugee camp to work with our friend Giuliano Merchamis in the Freedom Theater, and we thought that we are changing the world, and the Arab Spring came. And I felt so lucky that after I learned from Edward Said what binationalism is, Giuliano taught me how to dance the binationalism and how to be part of it. And we did a beautiful conference that Alain and Slavoj enlightened me about Antigone here, because we were working on to do Antigone in Janine refugee camp. Because always was important for us the particular and the universal, and to speak why we fight the Israeli oppression, also to fight for women's rights in the camp and everywhere, also in Colombia. And doing all that, suddenly Giuliano murdered, and the Arab Spring became kind of wintry a bit. And we felt very weak, and I tried to understand why bother, why to continue. There was a big feeling of depression. And then the words of Alain helped me so much, because he taught me in a way, and taught us, I think, and taught many people who try to do art. What is art when you come from a position of weakness? What is art when hardly nothing is possible, when you hardly exist? And this I realized from Alain's words, that what we did in Janine was more presentation, not representation. Because when we do art here, and I want to speak about Waiting for Godot because we perform it here really in Colombia as well. When we do, you know, in theater here in Broadway or Germany or whatever, so the audience know they're going to see like 2 Ibsen, 1 Hamlet, 1 radical young guy, and maybe something else. And they all come so ready, and the ideology is already there, structure, and we just have to represent the ideology that we all function. But in Janine refugee camp, we didn't have audience, we didn't know what is the text, we didn't know if we should do Western art or should we do Palestinian art. And this place is what Alain taught us is militant art, or radical art. We spoke, he doesn't like the word radical because it came from English. But
not only.
But it gave us, when Giuliano was murdered and we continued to work, this understanding of working, that we have to create the audience, to create the context, that we go to the future. And then it was hard enough to work for 2 young women to do Didi and Gogo from Waiting for Godot, to come here to Europe and to the States and realize that the Beckett estate doesn't allow them to play because they think Beckett doesn't allow women to play Didi and Gogo. And it was so important and so generous also for James to invite us here that we realized really that they inventing a new place. They didn't come to show how they can play a Western play nice to you guys. They, Mariam and Batul, they came to teach us how they are the only one who can really interpret Beckett in those time and recreate Beckett from the beginning. And Beckett, it's another great love that Alain gave me with his amazing book on Beckett. So I just want to read one text, very short one, that from the movie that Mariam Abu Khaled, Batul Taleb, and myself made after the loss of our friend Julian Omer Khamis. It was a film that started as a healing process, as something, again, as we said, a presentation. And it became something that gave up the step to go forward to the new project. And what we wrote there was, militant art is the art of the weak, the art of the ones who hardly exist in the public realm. Militant art is the ability to create power from this position of weakness. Those who are ready to take risk for the sake of art are those who might create a new form of art. So I would like to dedicate this session for our friend Julian Omer Khamis, who did follow this instruction. Thank you for being here so much and teach me those ways.
You disappear.
I give you the space here. I'll be back.
So, my first question will be how we can describe the world as it is today. Because the question of art is always also the question of time, the question of context, the question of the world as it is. I think we must first observe three fundamental points. The first one is, in some sense, that our world is unified today by a very strong structure. The globalized capitalism, everywhere in the world, you know that perfectly, the organization of societies is practically the same. A small financial, commercial, and industrial oligarchy rules all the important things. Every individual is defined from the point of view of the structure, naturally, by its position in regard to money. How this individual earns its money. It's the question of salary. How this individual spends its money. It's the question of the big planetary market. An individual, for the dominant structure of the world, is a mixture of salary on the side of production and the spending on the side of the market. Somebody who is neither a member of the oligarchy, nor a salarié employé, nor able to spend money in the market, in fact does not exist. We can say that that sort of people are the inexistent term of the structure as such. It's the first point. Second point, inside the structure, the unified structure, there exist naturally big differences. Not only between the oligarchy and the others, but inside the others. The situation can be brutally described. The oligarchy today is composed of certainly less than 1 billion of persons, maybe 10% of the global population of the world. 10% of the living human beings in this world. On the other side, we have 50% of the population, near 4 billion today, who have nothing in terms of capital. No money, no houses, no shares, no lands, and so on. And inside this enormous group, we have a subgroup of 2 billion of human beings. We not only have nothing at all, but have no stable access to a job, and so have no access to the market. So, for the capitalist structure, these 2 billion of people don't really exist. And in the middle, we have 40% of the population, near 3 billion, who compose the middle class. They have a stable job, more or less, and they have some money, and they are present in the global market. That is the second point. The third point is that all that is the cause of big contradictions and violent situations. Because it's in complete opposition to elementary justice, the cause is simple. Here we often speak of democracy, but it's the norm and language of the middle class of Western world. When you have so monstrous inequality, democracy is an empty word. And in the great majority of countries, not only we have not democracy, but we have no real possibility of democracy. So our world is full of local wars, bloody powers, superstitions, slaughter, religious conflict, and also ignorance, selfishness, and notably in the rich countries of the Western world, a strong suspicion and absolute disregard for everybody who has not the habits, the beliefs, and the dominant ideology of the middle class. Now, as a result of all that, which is a short but, in my opinion, true description, we can say that the subjective situation, so the subjective situation is distinct from the global objective structure. In the subjective situation, we have what I name a disorientation. A disorientation. At the subjective level, our world is a disoriented world. First, we have no idea of another structural existence of societies than the inclusion in the globalized capitalism. From the 80s of the last century, with the absolute failure of the classical communism and of socialist states, we live in a world which is under the rule of the one vision, one structure, one idea about the global constitution, the global organization of production, social links, and society. Second, this structure, which is the structure of the unique possibility, this structure proposes no other future than its indefinite continuation. And this continuation is in fact the way to the worst in some sense. You know, a fundamental law of the globalized capitalism is the law of concentration of capital. And from many years, we assist to enormous concentration. So the oligarchy will become smaller, and is becoming smaller. The part of humankind which has nothing will be greater. And the middle class itself, you assist to this point today, the middle class itself is under the clear threat to be impoverished. Third, for all these reasons, the world will be more and more violent. And peace will be a dream without any clear way for its realization. We can see today, it's an objective observation, that all military actions of the Western world not only have not created peace, but as an effect of the destruction of some states, like in Iraq, in Libya, in Sudan, or in Somalia, have created, in fact, a bloody anarchy. Even the very long military occupation of Afghanistan is a failure. So all that is, in fact, under the rule, the common rule today. What imports is health of the global market. All the rest can be and maybe must be abandoned. So the subjective result, anywhere, of the absence of a vision of the future. In pure countries, frustration, armed revolts, violent return to obscure traditions. Even on our countries, we have in middle class a fear to lose some privileges. And the result, you know that here, is dark nationalism, racism, and xenophobia, like with in France.
Ah, okay. Now you can start.
You must say that soon. I don't go to the beginning. No. I am ready. But so even in our country, we have in middle class itself a fear to lose some privilege, and the result is nationalism, racism, and xenophobia, like within France, the National Front, you know that, and here, after all, Donald Trump, and some other guys of the same flow. And the worst is probably the apparition in many places of a desperate and nihilistic youth. Without any future, any orientation, the life is, after all, without any prize at the end. And you can sacrifice in a nihilistic manner the life of many people, included your proper life. All that composes the true existence and the dangerous growing of what we can name a new fascism. New fascism, not only we can see that today in poor countries devastated by civil wars, but new fascism here too, symmetrically, as an answer to the fascism in other countries. We have the growing of the possibility of fascism here. We have known all that during the 30s of the last century. It's not an imaginary vision. And we can see in my country and in other countries of the Western world many symptoms of all that. many symptoms concerning a sort of hate of all what is stranger, a sort of new form of racism, and finally a sort of war, religious war, without any true content. And so, you know, my description is maybe the dark description, but the tendency is what imports. And the tendency today is clearly not the dominant tendency, not the growing of a new vision of the global world as it is, but inside this world of many negative tendencies, which are of, at a big scale somewhere, but can be at a big scale everywhere if we don't be cautious, politically conscious. So against the new fascism, I think we can observe that all forms of all politics are not adequate. They cannot stop the growing, the progressive growing of this form of fascism. And it's because fascism, new fascism, as old fascism, can be inscribed in the political structure of our countries. After all, Marine Le Pen in my country or Trump in your country are inside the ordinary play of the political game. Maybe they are not, for the moment, at the top, but they work to be. They work to be, and it's not something which is becoming outside the ordinary democratic world. It's something which is inside. And so the point is that against that sort of new fascism, which is a result of all the fundamental contradictions of the world as it is, we must have a new global vision. We can propose a new global vision. We cannot only stay as a new tendency inside the world as it is and so on. We must propose a rupture, a strategic rupture with the world as it is. That is a new global vision in the same sense as we have had a new vision during the 19th century, part of the 20th century. But today all that is practically very, very, very weak. And so there is something free for the new fascism. There is something free. There is a new space without strong possibility of resistance, even if many people, maybe the majority of people, are against the growing of this new fascism. It's not sufficient. It's not sufficient. We can see that even at the beginning, the first year of the becoming of Hitler as power in Germany, the majority of people was not on the side of Hitler. They become on the side of Hitler after. So I have personal fear that we are installing the quite vision of what can happen, and maybe because a new strategic vision, a new political strategic vision, practically does not exist or is very, very weak today. My name for this new global vision, everybody knows, is New Communism. And you know, it had been the play on the 30s. The 30s, finally, the central conflict has been between fascism and communism. Today we say sometimes that they were the same thing. But during the 30s, not at all the same thing. It was a central conflict of the world. And during the Civil War in Spain, and after that during the Second World War, we have seen that even maybe it was the same thing, but we were very happy to the position of the Soviet Union during the war. And the alliance between democratic nations and Bolshevik power as one fundamental reason, which was to destroy fascism. There is no absolute repetition in history. But today, we are in the form of crisis of capitalism. This capitalism is globalized. It's the unique law of the world. Inside that sort of world, we are growing of a new fascism. But we are without any capitalism. Okay, it's bad. But the organization of the fight against this growing is weak, probably too weak. But in all that, what the art and the artist can do. Because, after all, the goal of this talk. The art, you know, is by itself different from politics. We can have some sequence of close relationship between art and politics, but art is different from politics. The question of power, the creation of new forms of political action, of new form of organization, and so on, are not directly artistical questions. But maybe today we must pay attention to the possibilities of art, of new forms of art, precisely in the field of the world that it is. First, I think that the art can have a strong effect as a radical critics of the structure of the world. So it's at individual and subjective level, after all. Because the artist can be in a school, but the artist is an individual at the end. And the effect of the art can be a collective one, in theater, by cinema, and so on. But at the end, the effect is measured by a transformation of individuals. So art is potentially at the level of individuals. And I think that the critical possibilities are today of real importance. Why? Because precisely we have an unified structure of the world. So it's not the conflict between two structures, between two visions. It's a domination without, in some sense, any global contradiction of the structure. So the construction of a political strategic way different from the structure will certainly be a great labor during a long sequence. But the art can say something immediately. The art can create differences inside the structure at the subjective level. Art can be in the possibility to present something like a new vision, like an other world inside the dominant world. Art can propose the idea of new forms of equality between human beings. It's the very essence of art to be indifferent to hierarchy in societies. Even the more aristocratic art by itself is at the end indifferent to the social hierarchies. Art is able to propose different forms, different new forms of sensibility. So art can show that global difference is possible, At the level of perception, sensible perception of the world, it's possible. So it's also possible at the level of structure. That is the first point. the capacity of art to organize some form of new critics of the globalized capitalism and all these subjective effects create, in my opinion, the fact that art is today very important. Very important. Not only by itself, but by all its possible consequences. But it's a negative possibility, a critical possibility to indicate that something else maybe is possible. But it's not completely sufficient by the fact that today, at the end, critics is not sufficient. Critique is not sufficient. I think that our failure is on the side of affirmation, not on the side of critics. Finally, to critique the globalized capitalism is abstract possibility for everybody. But to affirm something else is something much more difficult. And so the affirmative creation of the new possibility is the most difficult work. And naturally, the creation of this new sense, this new affirmative sense of the world as a totality is not directly the question of artistic creation. It's a question, finally, of social nature, of political nature, the question of transformation of the power, of relationship between all human beings and so on. But in art, we can find the possibility to affirm the possibility. And that is a very strong possibility for the art. The art is also the kingdom of possibility. Because in art we can have experiences, art can take the risk of experiences concerning the possibility to affirm new possibilities. And today it's really important. You know, I think that the most important victory of the globalized structure of today has been finally the affirmation that nothing else was possible. It was not to say that it was very good. After all, we can say today that it's not so very good, so good. But the strength of the structure, the contemporary structure, is to convince everybody that nothing else is possible. Okay, we are not so good, but you see, you know that communist state was absolutely bad, and we are better. We are better. We are not the paradise, but we are not the hell. Maybe we are purgatory. It's a good definition of the propaganda of globalized capitalism. Okay, we are not the paradise. Against the hell, purgatory is better. And so, you know, it's possible in the field of art, notably popular art and experimental art, the two, to say that this distribution is not true. Is not true. That there is no fundamental reason to affirm that the best is always the less bad. It's a weak argument. After all, we must imagine that the way of the history of humanity is in the direction of something better than the situation today, something better than globalized capitalism. Why globalized capitalism is a necessity? Very often it is said that capitalism is natural and socialism or communism are artificial. yes, in some sense, we can say that if you accept rivalry, savage opposition between men for richness and so on, that is the way of struggle for life. If struggle for life is the last word of humanity, okay, capitalism is natural. But it's a bestial humanity. And so I think that we can go beyond this idea of something natural to affirm that after all humanity can construct its proper vision of itself and to propose a strategic vision of itself, and not only what is the result of a very bloody, violent and conflictual history. And in this direction, we can have something of artistic nature, because really the art is finally the kingdom of possibility. I remember on this point the poem of Bertolt Brecht. Bertolt Brecht, after all, was a poet of the sequence of crises of communism. It was the beginning of the crisis. Why? Because he was a testimonial, he witnessed Brecht, the failure of German communism against fascism, the defeat of the German communism. So he was, as a poet, in the affirmation of possibility in a situation of complete failure. So it was near us, in some sense. Near all, we search a new vision in the context of complete victory, after all, of our historical enemy. And I quote the poem Praise of Dialectics. Our Praise of Dialectics. It's a very beautiful title for a poem. It's not every day that we have a beautiful poem, the title of which is Praise for Dialectics. Naturally, the philosopher is glad. And I quote some parts of the poem. Of the oppressed, many say now, what we want will never happen. You know, the subjective negativity. What we want will never happen. And all the poem criticize this subjective vision and criticize precisely the word never. When they, it's a very bad thing to say never. We don't say never. What we want will never happen, no. And the artistic vision, the poetical vision, is to say that we must never say never. And why? And the development of the poem at the end says that whoever has recognized his condition, how can anyone stop him? If we recognize your condition, it's the first step to never say never. Because if we recognize really your condition, nobody can stop you at the end. And the poem at the end says that because if you recognize your condition and when anyone can stop you, because the vanquished of today will be the tomorrow's victors, and never will become already today, and never will become already today. That is this point that the work of art can say. And it's not surprising that Bertolt Brecht here is a poet, not a political militant, not yes, he was a communist, but the point here is not communism as such, as an ideology, is a communism inside the political determination. And this sort of determination is that never will become today by the strength of artistical creation. Artistical creation can create a new today, a presence, a presentation of something which probably will exist in the future and maybe in an obscure future, but will, the poem affirm the existence today of this future. That is the existence of the possibility. And so it would be my conclusion. In obscure times, and when we are, in some sense, tired of the political will, and when we have the temptation to say what we want will never happen, the work of art can say, never, 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 never will become today.
Thank you so much, Alain Badiou, Udi Aloni. I didn't think 20 minutes in that there'd be much inspirational coming around the corner, so thank you for that too. But I wanted to start the questions precisely on that note of optimism and inspiration by asking something maybe too simple to be anything other than disingenuous. And that is to simply ask, what do you mean by art tonight? Because I think what you mean by art tonight feels a little different to me than what you've meant by art at times in the past. And I want to know why it feels a bit different, and the use to which art is being put tonight, how that feels a little bit different in this context.
You know, I return to an abstract point. I have proposed that philosophy exists under 4 different conditions, to be my view. And these 4 conditions are 4 forms of possible truth in my jargon. Okay. And these 4 conditions are science, and primarily mathematics, politics, in the form of, not of the state power, but of the sense of invention by people of something new. So politics, art, naturally, and law. Law at the level of invention of something like a new relationship with the other. So, and I affirm that philosophy cannot exist without the existence of the 4 conditions. So I accept to say that philosophy comes after. It's not at the beginning of all things, philosophy. Not at all. It's my form of historical materialism, if you want. Yeah. We have philosophy because we have concrete, real, historical process of truth in science, in art, in politics. So we have in philosophy always the question of the relationship between different conditions. And it has been a question that we can find from the beginning. We can find that sort of question in Plato, for example. We have in Plato exceptionally long discussion concerning, for example, the relationship between art and politics, with a deceptive conclusion. At the end, I think that for Plato, the only good art is military music. And I love Plato. You have also, really, in Plato, meditation concerning the relationship between love and science. Because the question of the transference, the question of relationship to others, exists inside the transmission of science, and so on. And so we have the question of relationship between art and politics as a very old questions in the field of philosophy. And a very difficult one. A very difficult one because there has been always temptation for philosophy to go more on the side of science and temptation to go more on the side of art. It's clear today. You have analytic philosophy, which is on the side of science, logic, grammar, and so on, and a part of continental philosophy with Heidegger, for example, which is clearly on the side of art, poetry, and so on. This division is fatal, because when you exclude one condition, we install something like mutilation, something like a form of destruction of the very essence of philosophy. And so your question, return to the question, your question finally is the question of a change in my vision concerning the relationship between art and politics in the last years. And you have seen that. You have seen that. It's a change in my youth and in my beginning in philosophy. I was much more in political engagement. And I was something convinced that political engagement creates immediately a new future. And I was not alone in this case. It was a common idea during the 60s and the 70s, practically in all countries in the world. So I was in the conception of art largely militant art. Militant art, as Udi said. Militant art was in the question of the possibility to art to be inscribed in the political determination. With more or less freedom, but to be strategically included in our political order. And the form of militant art was very near, after all, the Sartrean conception, the conception of Jean-Paul Sartre concerning engaged art. But you know, Sartre himself was in another world. He was before the victory of globalized capitalism. It was in a world where we have two possibilities. Even if you criticize fiercely Soviet Union and so on, you do that from the point of view of the idea that exist two possibilities. And so inside the existence of two strategic possibilities, we are always the question on what side is the work of art. On what side is the work of art. And so it was, in some sense, a simpler situation. When we have practically the existence of only one strategic vision of the world. We cannot have the idea on what side is the work of art. It's much more obscure. We can only say that the work of art has three possibilities, and not two. Three possibilities, and the last is difficult. First possibility, be on the side of the world as it is. And after all, even today, there exist some forms of official art. Official art, which can be avant-garde and so on, which can be a part of modern art. It's not because you are something like an official art that art is by necessity archaic. No, we have, as you know, a very important part of the artistical production today is in the market. And this presence in the market has naturalized many effects concerning the art itself. So it's the first possibility. The second, and I must say that the form of nihilistic art, of the end of art of the destruction of art, can be on the side of the world as it is. Absolutely. Because no problem for the market to send nihilistic production. And in fact, no radical difficulty for fascism to be inside the globalized capitalism. They are not outside. Even Islamic State or Front National in France are absolutely inside the globalized capitalism, not outside. Okay. So the art also can be inside the situation, even in violent, nihilistic forms and so on. It's the first possibility. The second possibility is a purely negative one. That is to create an art with the goal of which is to criticize the structure, but without any affirmative dimension concerning another possibility. And the third possibility is that we have what I name the art of the possibility. And so that is a change. That is a change because when we are in the situation where we can define clearly what is the engaged art, on the side of revolution, new forms of organization, we can speak of a militant art. We are in our world in today. I am much more on the side of art. The work of art today must be the art of the possibility of the possible. But the possibility of the possible is a very important dimension of the possible. Because if you affirm that something is possible, and if the work of art is saying, okay, this possible is really possible in art, in a new form of art, you have something like a subjective product.
Well, here's an artist who wants to say something.
Yeah, is it working?
Yeah, that's working.
So I can sing. I want to
That would be the art of the impossible.
the art of horror.
Oh, it's technology.
I would like to think with Alain on this issue. First, when I thought of the model, I had this model of art. It was art, philosophy, and action. That each one for me was a mean for the other, but also an end for itself. And for a while I tried to hold all three of them because without one of them, the whole collapse. And then I realized that one should speak from one position. Like I can speak from the position of the art, and yet I have to hold the action, to be with the body wherever I am, and to be with the philosophy, with the thinking. And then when I thought about which art we look, I thought it's not really which, but also sometimes where is the location. And I thought about this because if here we do art, like in different places here that feel like engage with social issues and all that, in the end it feels like an art for art's sake. That all of it is really a tool to celebrate self-indulgence of art. And in a praising dialectic, as we said, in a weird way, by moving to Janine refugee camp, be out, one of the few places that I felt is out of the system, there to do art for art's sake is the true resistance. There to deal with high quality, to be able to create high quality, or to be able that the artist will feel as artist as such, without any support of the world, because it's out of the world. This was in a way the most powerful appearance of art. So also I had to move into Janine refugee camp to stop to do the political art I did in Israel when I was in the hegemony.
But I mean, it's tough for me to commute between classes to Janine to do art. So without taking anything away from what you're saying, which I think rings true, it seems to me by way of open discussion, but to you guys, I'll just simply register I'm not yet convinced, and I would rather myself, if I had time and space, make the argument against art. I'm very suspicious of this discussion. I'd rather join with Siegfried Krakauer and a line of thinking that's more or less died out until a few minutes ago when I thought, well, I should revive it, at least for tonight. No, it hasn't. But I mean, it really just push back on this idea a little bit, and maybe we're making too much of art in this context.
But I just have to answer because the Janine, I can say each one, like you said, each one have jihad in heart, so there is the Janine in heart. I thought of the concept of Badiou, of Alain, of the true event coming away from outside, from the void inside. For me, going to Janine is not to hide in the jungle of Janine or something like that. It's you going out in order to bring it into the center and functioning. That's exactly what we did. And in a way, you also traveled in your way to Janine.
Yeah.
So this travel of each one.
I'm suspicious.
Who is not suspicious?
Because I get cred, like, hey, I went to Ramallah, to the seminar. But the question really is precisely this question of circulation, in which, when I ask the question, what is art? And I do think that this idea of art has somehow a specificity or a particularity that falls outside of a commodity structure that allows itself some form of oppositionality or positivity outside of this global dominant regime of the commodity. Feels to me like we still need to go back to those discussions of Adorno and think through some of the deeper structures when we assume of art as having this particular identity for us.
I'll do it short and then you answer that. That's
exactly,
it's exactly why I said that always I feel that I need to have the action, the art, and the philosophy together. And I mentioned it from the beginning. Yeah. And it was very clear here when it was Occupy Wall Street that it's very easy to be a communist professor like Jameson where it's safe because there it's okay, and then it was kind of stupid to see all the people that do activity and refuse to have any theory because they are really in the field and like make stupidity as power, and here they make power as stupidity. And the fact that really that all the time, and that was why I dedicated for Giuliano, because Giuliano was in a way a true communist. He was with the body all the time in the place. He was thinking with the theory, what is the place to come? What is the place to come in this place? And it was the art that has to be so beautiful, as beautiful that he was himself. And only with all three of them I can hold myself not to collapse to the void that pretty much that's what we feel most of the time.
A long word here, or shall we open to questions?
Yes, just one word. When I speak of the possibility of the possible for art, this possibility is always something which you can find in the real, in some sense. It's not abstract possibility of the possible, because if it is abstract possibility purely, it's the same thing as the possible as such. what I name the possibility of the possible is something which creates some symptoms, concrete, in the real, and by a new knowledge, a new experience of the sensible as such, we create that sort of possibility of the possible. So I completely agree with you when you recall that finally to do a work of art in the direction of the strategic new possibility is always in the field of new effective relationship inside people, with people, in concrete situations, and so on. And without all that, we cannot have something like a new form of the possibility of the possible. So it's an engaged art too, but in another sense. Not because you engage a political idea which is constituted, but because you propose locally and coming from something like some new experiences, the possibility, the effective possibility, symbolically as a metonymy of the possible. And so it is why I think that art today must be very often a travel, first a travel in the direction of people, of unknown people, in the direction of the mass of people, new country, terrible situation, and so on. We have, and in cinema, naturally, cinema has strong possibilities in this direction. It's striking for me the number of movies which are, for me, the side of the possibility of the possible, because they are very near the concrete existence of people in all forms of conflict. They realize that sort of travel, and it is why we have more and more no real distinction between, in cinema, between artistical fiction and documentary. And we have the new concept of docu-fiction. Docu-fiction being precisely the possibility for that sort of art to speak from inside the situation, the collective situation, to propose a work of art at the end, a work of art which is the production from inside the situation of the possibility of the situation as such. Not only of the situation as situation, but the situation as possibility. And this is why I think that today there is on the side of cinema, and first, my friend is a good example. There have been movies concerning the situation actually in Israel and Palestine, but also in other countries, like Iran and so on. We have an example of the possibility of contemporary art as also a sort of new knowledge of the situation, and from the new knowledge of the situation to produce something like a new possibility.
Look, you guys are starting to win me over for art. We have a microphone here, and there's a gentleman there who's had his hand up. So,
hi. You know, one of the probably greatest figures in defeating fascism was Alan Turing, who wrote the Enigma Code, which at the time was considered impossible. And my observation in response to your talk tonight is, I don't think the defeat of fascism is going to reside in the realm of art or politics or tradition. I think it's going to be an Alan Turing type figure, but not in the realm of code breaking, but who comes up in the realm of economics. Because ultimately, all the misery in the world that you describe is the fault of the economics profession, not figuring out how to eliminate human want, which is what it purportedly exists to do. And my only other observation was you brought up this idea of militant, you brought up this idea of official art. But wouldn't a militant art just be the official art of the militants?
So, what, you need somebody to speak French too?
Yeah, do you need a
You need the French.
translate? I think there's a person there I recognize from before who can translate.
I want always understand completely the question because it's a facility to answer without understanding because you say what you want.
If the militant art is not becoming the official art of the militant.
Okay. Naturally, I have said that the new strategical vision and the new politics are finally close relationship to economy and general organization of societies and contradiction inside the world as it is. I just observed that there is in the work of art a possibility to witness all that before sometimes it's complete reality. To witness the beginning, the step of the new construction. At the end, for me, art is not reducible to politics and to economy. So I agree with you that fundamentally the question is not an artistical question. But I maintain absolutely that today, where economical proposition and strategical politics are very weak, the work of art can affirm something as a symptom concerning the possibility, not the possible as such, not the realization of the possible, but the real of the possible. It's not the same thing. The possible as possible. And yes. A militant art, you say, can become an official art.
Of the militants.
Of the militants.
And all that is in close relationship to the question of the relationship between art and the state. And you know, today, the state of affairs, the state has economical state, money, official, and so on. But as we know, if the communist vision is reduced to a new form of the state, art becomes in fact something which is only a medium for propaganda. And the medium for propaganda cannot be really an artistical creation. It's different from engaged art itself. So this question is also of political nature, because it's the question of the position of art in regards to the relationship between politics and the state and the power. It is the point. So we must introduce three terms to examine, for example, the destiny of artistic creation during all the communist power in Russia, for example. We have three terms. We have the possibility of artistic creation, we have the political determination, and we have the state power. And it's only the dialectic of the three terms that can observe the history of that, which has been practically an attempt to reduce the work of art to propaganda of the power.
We have other hands up. There's a gentleman right back there.
Be willing to comment on what you said tonight and how, and your current feeling about China's cultural revolution.
The Cultural Revolution in China has been the end, the final end of all the first attempt to construct a socialist society. It's the end. It's interesting that this end has not been at all as in Russia. Has not been a sort of peaceful disparition of all the forms of the communist determination in Russia. It has been a fierce struggle, a very violent struggle, with engagement of millions and millions of people. At the level of artistic creation, it has been practically nothing. It's only today, before many, many years after the Cultural Revolution, that we can find not only testimony, but some very interesting work of art concerning the sequence, particularly poems. There is a great modern poetry in China today, and a part of this poetry is also sort of witness of the terrible years of the Cultural Revolution. I am interested in Cultural Revolution because precisely it has been the last attempt to save something, what we can name the relationship to the power, to mass movement, to revolution as such. Because it was not be like in Russia, decision taken in the obscurity of the power, but it has been a very extraordinary complex mass movement, division of the party itself. You must recall that at the beginning it was the movement of revolt against the state itself. So it was something where the power of the party was divided because we have a sort of big revolt against the party itself. All that finally is obscure and has been a complete failure. Complete failure because today China is purely and that was the idea. Because in Cultural Revolution, we have explicitly the idea that there exists in the Communist Party a tendency in the direction of capitalism. I remember that many people say, oh la 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 la, what is that sort of thing, the existence of a capitalist tendency in a Communist Party? Okay, but now we know. First, China is a purely capitalist society, and second, the direction of this society has for name Communist Party. And when a good story, somebody asked one day to a very strong official of the Communist Party in China, the question, it's strange that you have the name Communist Party today. What is communism? We see capitalist, speculation, and so on, prisons in the modern market. And the answer of the official was, we have the Communist Party, so we are in charge to define what is communism. And so we can return to a sentence of Deng Xiaoping, which was a very clear sentence, which was the first stage of communism is capitalism. And so at the end, the terrible years of cultural revolution has been a desperate attempt, collective, individual in the party, outside the party, in the youth, and in the part of the workers and so on, to define what can be done, what must be done to inside the very strong but also immobile socialist society, precisely to create the new way. They have the same problem as us today. They have the same problem as us, but they have the problem inside the despotic structure of the socialist state. This is why it has been so violent. But today we have also the same problem inside the capitalist structure, not against the capitalist tendency, like in China in the 60s, but against the capitalist victory. But the same problem, what is today the new formulation, the new strategic vision of something else. And it is why I am interested for the last attempt to define something like that in the condition of socialist state, and it has been a big failure. But after all, in the 19th century, we have had the Commune de Paris, which has been also an attempt during 2 months to define another possibility for the global existence of society, and it has been at the end a very bloody failure. Thousands and thousands of workers killed in the streets of Paris. And Commune de Paris was really interesting, even in its violence and its failure, because it was, at the beginning of the 20th century, it was the last attempt to create a new society. And so, generally, we must have the necessity to examine the failure and to say about the failure something new which is different and not reducible to the fact that there are failures.
Hold on, let's see. And, yes, I guess going back there a second.
You described the role of art in politics as opening up new political space through the possibility of the possible. I wondered about the role of politics itself in turning that possibility of the possible concrete and actual. How does the political process turn it into something real?
You know, probably in politics, but after all, it's not my subject. In politics, we have always three terms or three questions in every form of politics which creates something new. We have the question of the mass movement. It's clear that without mass movements, we have no chance to the birth of something like a new political affirmation. Is the question of mass movement today the true question? Is not, it's unclear because we have mass movements today. We have mass movements in many parts of the world. We have Occupy Wall Street, we have the Arab Spring, we have in France big movements in the suburbs some years ago, and so on. So we cannot say that the situation is purely passive and negative existence of people. We have some mass movement. And the first point is always to recognize that the existence of a mass movement is better than the non-existence of a mass movement. Don't forget this. Because during many times we have the experience of a political party constituted of professionals in some sense. We were the judge of mass movement. It was my fundamental experience in May 68 in France, where the Communist Party has said, oh, this movement is not the good one. But after all, we have always some reason to say that the mass movement is not perfect, and so on. And so there is in politics the historical fact that we must recognize the mass movement, we must be inside the mass movement and not outside. Must also say if something seems to be weak or so. The first point. The second point is the state. Because mass movement is always in relation, more or less antagonistic, with the power. And the power is always here. The power, the state, is a difficult term because it's, in general, a sort of representation of a dominant structure, precisely. It is the political representant of the dominant structure locally. There is today a global structure, but we have many states, many governments, which are in fact the local executive of the global structure, with difference between them. Because when the situations are different, we have different forms of state appropriate to be finally the political execution of the global structure. So we have the state, and concerning the state, the question of politics is and has been, is political affirmation reducible to the attempt to size the power? It has been the idea during all the 19th century and a big part of the last century. Finally, Lenin, for example, was saying that the political question is the question of power. I think that today we must examine this affirmation. Certainly, the power, the state, is a part of the political determination. But we know today that if we reduce the question of political existence to the question of power, we have finally the reduction of the new determination of politics to the power itself, and we have something which is not really in close relationship to the mass movement. Because every power has a strong tendency to repress mass movement, even if the power is a good one in some sense. So we must have, in the new politics, we must have a new relationship between a new supposed power and the mass movement. We must have some form of control of the state by mass movement themselves. The difficulty is mass movement is not a permanent thing. Mass movement begins and we cannot order to people to be always in mass movement. It's impossible. maybe it's a sad impossibility. But the state continues. The state is permanent.
I want to put a bit maybe doubt or question here. And I want to use those terms because I came from Benjamin conference in Ramallah, and I want to use this term of divine violence from critical violence that sometimes relate also to your true event. And I want to put it in relation to your question that if a mass movement, if I can consider the ISIS, the Islamic State, as a mass movement, and because when we try to speak about the divine violence or the pure violence, for example, in the suburb of France, or the Palestinian that come, we use it in a way, in a romantic way, to adopt Benjamin, and also suddenly raise question if the Islamic State, the ISIS, it's also kind of a pure violence, a divine violence that comes. I mean, when I go more deep inside, I realize that this is really the cultural revolution of the West, not in a way of conspiracy that we created ISIS and all that, but it is the manifestation of our fantasy of pure violence. It is the manifestation of our fear. And when we go more inside, we realize that it was very interesting in Ramallah, the discussion on it, that from outside, if you look outside, you said, yeah, it is a creation of our fantasy of America. It's all about money, how much money each soldier get there. In the end, it's not the pure violence. In the end, it's the question of money, of who buy the gasoline, how Turkey is functioning there. And in the same time, how the Palestinian or the Arabs, Muslims said that they want to take responsibility on it and fight it and not put it on the West. But this issue, I speak about it, that when we speak about pure violence or about divine violence, always when we go more, when we zoom in, the mass movement also, you see, it's part of the power and not out of the power. And in this, it makes me very pessimistic sometimes, because it's this...
Because we give a false definition to mass movement. First, you largely reduce mass movement to violence, pure violence, or in my vision, mass movement generally is not violence, it's not by violence. If we see Basic 68, Occupy Wall Street, and even the biggest part of Arab Springs, where the point is not violence, the violence is on the side of the state, and in my opinion, the Islamic State is not at all a mass movement. It's a fascist state. It's on the side of the state, not of the movement. And it is not because we have some individuals, we are in a sort of sacrifice of themselves for that sort of idea that we can say that this is a mass movement. After all, we have had many circumstances, some sacrifice of fascists. So I think, and your intervention before my short term, and here my short term, because what I was saying is that the mass movement, strictly speaking, is always a mass movement if it implies different forms of the people of the population. Not one, not only one. Because if there is only one part of the population in the mass movement, it's a revendication. It's something else. It's something else. It can be a revolt, but it's not a mass. For example, during the Arab Spring, what was striking was the mixture of Muslims and Christians in Egypt, of middle class and workers, and so on. And that is the true composition of all real mass movement. And the relationship to the state is difficult because the state has not the same temporality as the mass movement. And the question of time in politics is fundamental. And mass movement is in a short time, maybe many months maybe 1 year, but it's really the limit. And the state is in the long time. And so the relationship between short time and long time is crucial in the determination of politics. And this is why politics cannot be reduced to one time, even the time of the Caesar of Rome. And this is why we must have a third time, a third term, a third dimension, which we can name political organization. Not only in the form of a political party, but political organization is the mediation between the mass movement and the state. This is why political organization don't be identified to the state. That has been the case in the communist country, party state, party is the same thing. It cannot be confused to mass movement because the political organization creates a new temporality. A temporality which comes from the mass movement, but which also exists after the mass movement or between two different mass movements and in a critical relationship to the state. So, what I name a political invention, in generally speaking, at the level of political organization today. Because mass movements, they can exist, the state is always here in some form, but the mediation between the two is the sensible point of politics, and this is why it's the question of collective organization. But even at the level of collective organization, I think that the work of art can say something today. Because after all, the work of art can be something of collective nature, even if it is in the question of audience, the question of public, the question of theater, the question of the great diffusion of cinema, the question of internet, and so on and so on. And
No, I would say yes.
It's it.
No, it's this question of temporality of political organization and the question of the temporality of the category of art, they start to sound very similar. And the question of temporality, so I think we have time for one more question, some summation. We did have a question literally from the floor before, so we'll go to you. There is a microphone, so hold on, he's going to make his way. I'm sorry to all of you who we didn't get to. And then we'll do some sum up.
Thank you. Many thoughts, but the temporality is where my question was also in terms of art versus both the economics that first question I asked and politics, which are related. I was very taken last week when you landed where you landed now with this introduction of a third term. Because when I'm taken by where you started tonight about the given that we are defined now by money more than ever, what we make, what we spend, and the idea that I'm preoccupied with, I curate art. I started in academia, sort of between art and art history, and became a curator. I work with artists, and the great success for me has been the creating of a possibility, mostly within institutions, where you do something that has a different temporality. And it's a possibility, not a promise. You don't know where it's going to go. But the thing that I found most troubling in the years that I've been working was the dominance of critique, the critical as what was celebrated, especially in academia. And I really think that art, to be effective, has to be affirmative in some way. So the question is, what does it affirm? And to my mind now, the thing that art cannot directly change the culture. Art cannot do what economics does. And I don't think art can be either have the kind of long-staying power of the state or it can have some of the immediacy of the mass movement at its best, and some of the duration when it means, in a way, of the state. But it really has to do it has to open a space. It has to open a possibility. And I think the way that happens is not only in a place, like what Udi was talking about, but by defining its own terms, by things that interact directly with real people. I want to just say one more thing. I think that when I think of what went wrong in the night, you could say that during the Clinton era, with the the new advent of technology, the idea that many people could invest, and many people could get credit, and many people could get real estate, was a huge new paradigm. It was the idea of a model other than scarcity. But it was co-opted, and I think it was co-opted around the arena that art needs to hold better, which is smart people who went into business co-opted what you could do with lots of small mortgages, let's say.
Okay,
and
so what I'm trying
to say is that the imagination that art, by getting derailed in just criticizing directly and imagining that you get credit for being on the right side of the argument, gave up something, and it needs to reclaim.
It is a very apropos point across a lot of issues. I mean, while being translated, I would want to push back on this idea of economics, and even Alan Turing is in some way an opposite imaginary to the aesthetic.
Right.
I mean, if you read Turing's essay on which eventually made a fantastic movie called The Imitation. When you talk about imitation, where he's thinking this stuff, he's thinking aesthetically. It's actually theater. He's creating a theater of queerness. It's about guys trying to pretend they're women, and how Dada becomes the guy pretending he's a woman. I mean, it's an amazing essay, but it requires a theatrical and aesthetic imagination. He really needed that thing. And economists today are the same thing. They're doing game theory. They're essentially programmers. They're working alongside people who are creating these aesthetic situations. So just a little aside here. I just don't want to have that split operate.
The thing about economics is they're not. I mean, I know a lot of economists, and they're not trying to fix problems in the world. I mean, he described it as purgatory. Yeah. They're playing around with game theory and other stuff, but they're not trying to think of anything new, because they're still sort of gloating over their defeat over communism.
I want to say my final thoughts in order that Alain will end it. Yeah. I just want to say a short final thing. Too many times in my life I was involved in mass movements, and I saw how they were hijacked by fascist movements. And I remember Benjamin that taught us that fascism is a revolution that failed. And there was two amazing advice that I got. One, when I was very depressed when my friend has been murdered and I really wanted to give up. Alain sent me a beautiful sentence that kind of became my motto, and he said, remember, the revolution is never a result, it's always a surprise. And I keep it with me in many of my Sisyphic work, and it's keep kind of hope. And second thing, another advice, I have two amazing mentors here with me, James for my cinema and Alain for philosophy and life. So take yourself a good rabbi, good mentors, and you can have some hope maybe to create something in your life.
Okay.
And Alain, your last one.
My conviction is that the idea of a fascist mass movement is a contradiction in its terms. Because the fundamental point of fascism is to propose an identity. Identity which is of national nature, which is of racist nature, which is something of religious nature. And when we have something like a movement of fascist structure, we have in fact a movement who proposes something like an identity. And so something which not only is not universal, but which is always against universality, which affirms the absolute rights of identity, the sovereignty of identity against universality. And so a mass movement, in the sense I give to the, is precisely recognizable by there is always something universal in a mass movement. Naturally, there exists situation, there exists some form of symbolic identities, but in the very historical determination, the mass movement is in the direction of universality. For example, it has been absolutely the case of the mass movement during the major part of Arab Spring. And everybody was interested in the world by the situation. And we are here Islamic determination, but we have Christian determination. We have a clear thinking of what everybody wants, generally in a negative form, it's a limit. Mubarak inside and so on. But all that is the constitution of a new figure of the collectivity. That is the point. A true mass movement is always a new figure of the collective existence and not the affirmation of a closed identity and of the strictly right of the closed identity. Even, for example, in the movement for the civic rights inside, in the United States, we have unity between black people and white people. It was a necessity for create a mass movement, a political mass movement in that sort of direction. So it is why the question is not the question of identification of mass movement to violence, revolt, and so on. Mass movement is a political category when we have sufficiently different components of the mass movement to speak of what they are as what constitutes their unity, having some form of universality. After that, I think that I return to my point. The political creation today is the creation of the third term, that is the creation of the new time, really. That is the point. What is the new time of politics? And it's a strategic question because during many times, the time of the political determination has been strictly the time of the event as such. That is the time of revolution, the time of insurrection, and so on. But this time cannot be the time of the state, cannot be the time of the long vision, the long edification of communism, and so on. And so, between that sort of eternal time of the power and the very short time of the mass movement in its political determination, we must introduce a mediation. This mediation, I think by necessity, something like a political organization. And so the problem today is to invent a new form of political organization, which is not, I take an example. Practically all political organizations today in the democratic world are present in elections. Okay. And so they are in the temporality of the state, by definition. They go to the polls because the state says that, okay, it's a moment. And so the very nature of the political organization finally is dictated, is imposed by the temporality of the state. At the opposite, if you create a purely insurrectional organization, militarized and so on, it was in some sense a Bolshevik party in, at the beginning. it's perfect for the short moment to be victorious in the insurrection, to crush the military force of the power. But after you have as a consequence to create a field of politics where every problem is a problem of destroy an enemy. And so you create enemies to destroy them as a solution of your problems. It's a large part of Stalinism. Stalinism was, in fact, a party of military nature, unable to solve really problems of the long time, and created every moment after every moment some crisis concerning enemies, which we must invent to crush them. And it has been and the definition of this point is terror. The terror is precisely the moment where we solve problems concerning contradiction inside the people by military means. That is, sentence to death, false enemies, and so it's today we cannot repeat the insurrectional way because we know the effect in the long time at the level of the state. We cannot repeat the idea of organization, political organization under the law of the state, that is in fact the democratic parties, and we cannot reduce politics to mass movements. So we must invent something which, in my opinion, does not exist today, which is a new political organization, and we return to finish to art. The art is certainly not the place to create the new political organization, but there is in art sensibility to collective determination which can be useful in the process of this creation. Okay.
We ended up yet again on a positive note. And for that, actually, this time, thank you, Alain Badiou.